value systems. We're also going to be exploring whiteness and position of privilege. So we're going to be looking at ourselves and our own social location, right? So even if we are people of color, we have maybe some areas where we have privilege. So everyone has sort of privilege and oppression, and so we're going to be sort of looking at potentially those areas so that we understand very clearly where we're privileged and not just sort of where we are oppressed, and really exploring the kind of this idea of whiteness, which hopefully you've had some experience with, beginning to look at that in that second HUPC class. Okay, this is just a quote from your book on page 5 from the introduction, which I really like because I think it also talks very well about what we're trying to do here, particularly in this course. It says, to revision the dominant discourses within family therapy, we must examine the ways in which we have organized our theory and practice and analyze how this arrangement replicates the dominant value system of our society. Such revisioning will be a slow and difficult evolution and will not take place without backlash. So the point here is that one is that we are really analyzing and thinking about how our own practice may replicate dominant value systems, but then also looking at, if we do challenge that, what is the backlash? You know, people are in some ways threatened by that. And it particularly, I mean, in therapy and sort of mainstream therapy, and we'll talk more about those and have those discussions as we get into class. But some people may very much react to that. Particularly people who have been sort of in practice and established and really people who haven't been trained in a way to really think about these kinds of issues. And this is sort of one example in thinking about the DSM, and I'd like to talk about this because so many people refer to the DSM as the Bible, right? And the DSM is certainly not a Bible, and it's not truth. It's a cultural document. And I'll give you some examples that show how different diagnoses in the DSM have changed over time based on different groups that we've needed to suppress or oppress. So, for example, there was a diagnosis in the DSM that was called drapetomania, which was the uncontrollable urge to escape slavery. So if a slavery escaped, this could be a diagnosis for them. The other diagnosis, Dysthesia Ethiopia, is destroying property on a plantation, being disobedient, talking back. And you can see how, you know, the idea of owning slaves, being a slave owner, could be something that would be considered potentially something that somebody that's disturbed or that has a mental illness might do, but there is no diagnosis for those who are in the position of power to have a corresponding disorder of the urge to possess slaves. So often labels throughout history have been used to control others. You see this with women in the 1950s with the use of anti-anxiety meds. You see this in terms of the diagnosis of schizophrenia. It was during the 60s when during the civil rights movement, when African American men became the group that were most represented in labels of diagnoses of schizophrenia, for example. Currently, the group that's disproportionately diagnosed as schizophrenic are immigrants. So I think that tells you a little bit about just the social context and how we understand different groups that are oppressed, and then the way that labels can be used in some ways to sort of reinforce that oppression. So the DSM, think of it really as a cultural document with ideas about normality and who's normal and who's not, and that it is in no way about science. A lot of these diagnoses come to be based on just different doctors who may see certain things and decide that there's enough consensus that it becomes a diagnosis, but not because there's scientific evidence of it. So this is just kind of another example, right, that we wouldn't diagnose the oppressor, we tend to diagnose those who are oppressed. So, for example, there is no addiction to domination disorder, right? To diagnose those people who can't resist subjugating or dominating others, or privilege disorder, right? The category for people who enjoy the unearned benefits afforded to them by virtue of living in a patriarchal, sexist, heterosexist, racist society. So just as an example, right, of sort of if you turn things around, what that would look like. This is the book, your book, McGoldrick and Hardy book, talks about this idea of revisioning education and what things have looked like over time. So we started with basically initially in therapy, clinical therapy, where women and minorities were basically absent from any sort of discussion. Then all of a sudden we opened this up and widened this lens and we included women. And then some consciousness evolves. Then we begin to kind of have a little bit more of a transformation, where we're beginning to really think about things more critically. And so it's more of an evolution and a process, right? Sort of thinking about what would this look like and what does this look like, to really think about issues of gender and sex and sexuality and race and how we understand our clinical work with different populations. So I think we're sort of in this process of evolution and thinking about how we learn and practice from this perspective. And so one of the things that the book talks about is this idea that eventually, sort of going through these different perspectives and these different stages, that we would have an opportunity to really redefine and reconstruct, individual and family therapy. And that's what I hope that our discussions will sort of do in terms of thinking about these issues and thinking about how we practice in a way that really respects diversity in a very significant way. And our own social work ethics, of course, require this. And this is part of why we have this diversity elective, because we're supposed to look at multiple forms of oppression, how they intersect, and how we respond to them. How do we advocate and be change agents in this process? And as a result, then we can think about sort of what would that mean then to have culturally competent feminist social work. And this is part of what you're going to be doing in your discussion today, is really thinking about that issue. And in the past, feminism itself has been criticized for not addressing intersections of social identity and oppressions. It was women of color that really pushed that idea of paying greater attention to diversity even within women, and a greater push for a greater commitment to ending all forms of oppression. So not just an emphasis on gender, but thinking about the intersection, for example, of class and race and gender and sexuality. And so I think sort of this second wave of feminism really thinks about these issues in a very different way than sort of this first wave of feminism that only dealt with gender. And you'll have one of your articles is this Gentlewarrior article, and so this is one of the things that I want you to think about in terms of thinking about what does that mean to be culturally competent, what do we need to understand, and what do we need to do, and how do we listen to the counter stories and help people in oppressed groups develop these counter stories to these dominant narratives of who they are. And so some of the recommendations in this particular article are dealing with recognizing the diversity within groups, experiencing diverse communities and relationships, becoming trained in cross-cultural knowledge, being aware and respectful of beliefs that differ from our own, really being able to listen, and how do we assess clients for experiences of discrimination, and not to be afraid of that. So I will stop here because I know it's hard to sort of watch one of these lectures on video. If you have any questions about the assignments on Canvas today in your module, let me know, and we will, and I certainly will be available online on email to answer any questions that you have. Okay, thank you very much. See you next week in person. And you'll have another assignment, of course, for your class on Thursday.